Welcome to the second relative clauses video from chapter 28 of Ecce Romani, and today's video is going to be exploring the building the meaning on page 5, so you'll want to have that out as we go through. Just to recap, a relative clause is a descriptive subordinate clause that modifies a noun in the main clause, which we call the antecedent. And we said that relative clauses are introduced by these relative pronouns. Here is our chart of relative pronouns, which hopefully you've memorized by now, qui, quae, quod, and you're going to want to have this with you. It's on page 4, or if you have a paper copy as we go along, that's going to help you out a lot. This was the Latin sentence we looked at in the first video. Cornelia est puella Romana, quae in Italia habitat. We said that quae in Italia habitat, who lives in Italy, is the relative clause here, and quae is the relative pronoun. Its antecedent was the noun-adjective pair puella Romana. When we look at the chart of the relative pronoun, though, there are several forms of quae, and we need to know which one is it. It can be only one. It can't be more than one. So how do we know which form of quae that is in the sentence? To do that, we need to start with the antecedent, and specifically the gender and number and case of that antecedent. In this sentence, puella Romana is feminine, it's nominative, and it's singular. And if you look at the sentence, it has to be that because it is the complement after the linking verb est, linking it with Cornelia. Cornelia is the subject of the sentence, so it's feminine, nominative, singular. Therefore, puella Romana has to be feminine and nominative and singular. Now think about it for a second. Think about the English translation of this sentence. Cornelia is a Roman girl who lives in Italy. That who lives in Italy, the who part of it, it's describing Roman girl. Well, Roman girl, like we've said, is feminine, and it's singular. So why would a relative pronoun be anything other than feminine and singular? It doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be masculine or neuter, and it wouldn't be plural. That just doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. And we know Latin's a logical language. So since puella Romana is feminine and singular, as we get rid of quae here, we know that that relative pronoun has to be the same. It has to be feminine, and it has to be singular. On our chart, which has 30 forms, we can actually limit it to then just 5. There are only 5 forms that are feminine and singular: quae, cuius, cui, quam, and qua. So that gets us part of the way there, but we need the case. We need to figure out the case of that relative pronoun. We know the word is going to be who, and to do this, let's look at how who functions inside that relative clause. And we should ask ourselves, is it a subject? Is it possessive? Is it an indirect object, a direct object, or is it after a preposition? And the reason we want to ask ourselves those questions, as we learned in Latin 1, if it's the subject, then it's going to be nominative. If it's showing possession in some way, it'll be genitive. An indirect object is going to be dative, direct object, accusative, and if it's after a preposition, it's ablative. Well, in this sentence, who is the person that's doing the living? And no, that's not a question. I'm not auditioning for who's on first, but that word who is the person that lives. It is the subject of habitat. Therefore, it has to be nominative case. We know based on the antecedent it's going to be feminine and singular, and the use in this sentence as a subject tells us it has to be nominative because a subject is always nominative. Who is doing the living? Who also describes puella Romana. It works in 2 ways. Looking at our chart, we had 5 forms, but only one of those is nominative. Quae. Quae is feminine, is nominative, and it's singular. That's why it's quae in this sentence. Cornelia est puella Romana, quae in Italia habitat. It's feminine, nominative, singular. That gives us 2 rules. We say that the form of a relative pronoun depends on 2 things. First, it depends on the gender and the number of the antecedent. We saw that with puella Romana. Secondly, its case is required by its function within the relative clause. It's very important that you remember that within the relative clause part. But we have to figure out how it functions inside the relative clause, and that function gives us the case. So it's actually pretty straightforward if you keep these 2 rules in mind. Let's look at another example. This one's from chapter 28, the first 2 lines. Crines eius curabant duae ancillae, quarum altera speculum tenebat, altera crines pectebat. Hopefully you're familiar and comfortable enough with relative clauses by now to be able to identify them in an English or a Latin sentence like this one. Here's our relative clause in red, from quarum to pectebat. And actually, even since there's a comma there, we have 2 relative clauses in parallel construction. the editors leave out a second quorum after that comma before that second altera. And we'll come back to that in a second. It's very important. Since we know our chart, we know that quorum is our relative pronoun, but we want to figure out here, why is it quorum? Why isn't it some other form of that relative pronoun? It can only be this form. To do that, we need to figure out the antecedent. To figure out the antecedent, we need to look at the main clause, and I've parsed it out here to get our subject, verb, and object. Our subject is duai ankylai, two maidservants. What were they doing? They were taking care of, and they were taking care of the direct object, her hair. So we have a subject, verb, object, and if you think about the translation of the sentence, two maidservants were taking care of her hair, one of whom was holding the mirror, the other of whom was combing the hair. That makes it pretty simple, as we throw up our rules here, to figure out that the antecedent of quorum is the maidservants. We have two of them. One's doing this one thing, one's doing the other thing. So to figure out the gender and the number and the case of quorum, based on our two rules, first, the gender and the number are going to be the same as the antecedent. Well, we said a few seconds ago that duai ankylai is the subject, so it's nominative and it's feminine and it's plural, since there are two of them. That means that quorum has to be feminine and it has to be plural, based on rule number 1 there on the bottom of the screen. On our chart, that again takes us from 30 options down to only 5: quae, quorum, quibus, quas, or quibus. But we still need to figure out which one it's going to be of those 5 cases. Our second rule says that the case is required by its function within the relative clause. Now inside the relative clause, I've put underneath the words there the subjects and the objects. And we have 2 different verbs, we have 2 different direct objects, but we have the same subject in each part, altera. You'll remember from your vocabulary that when we have altera and then a second altera, or even more, that comes to mean one and then the other, because we have a grouping. And just think about sentences that have one ... the other ... One of them said this, the other of them said that. The key word is of. That gives what we call a partitive genitive, which we talked about in chapter 25, if you want to go back and look at that. But when you have a group, you can describe part, hence the partitive. You can describe part of that group by using the genitive. One of them. And then the other of them did this thing. Only in this sentence, we're replacing them with whom. One of whom did this. The other of whom did that. So that of should be a key giveaway that you're using the genitive. On our chart then, we went from 5 not feminine plurals to only 1, feminine genitive plural. That's why we have quorum in this sentence. So that gives us a look at the first example on page 5 under the building the meaning. There are more that I'd like you to check out on your own. And then for some practice, try exercises 28C and 28D on page 6 so that you're ready to come into class with a good understanding of relative clauses. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.